All right. So for our third and final session, looking at pastoral considerations, caring for families and individuals. Again, a lot more that I could say if there was a longer period of time. I have more slides on this one, but I hope that I go through them quickly because a lot of it is like actual phrases and words and ideas, things you could say. And then we'll have time for some discussion. It's always encouraging to hear that the discussion on the previous two topics is already leading in this direction. It's not surprising that pastors would have pastoral questions. You have to deal with people in real life. But here we go. Historically, we have known that there are two very common patterns for people identifying as something other than their biological sex. And it's very different for men and for women. For men, the most common thing is what is called autogynephilia, which describes the idea of being sexually attracted to the idea of yourself as a woman. It can take two forms. Typically among younger homosexual men, it emerges in your late teens or early 20s. And you want to be attractive as a woman in order to be attractive to masculine men. The other form you will be familiar with from the case of Bruce Jenner, who now goes by Caitlyn, right? It's stereotypically masculine men who are successful from society's point of view as men, who it usually starts with cross-dressing. They like themselves in silky negligees and whatever else, and it's very stimulating. And that eventually leads to wanting other people to see them and be attracted to them in this same way. It's very, like from a clinical point of view, this was well understood, not controversial until quite recently. Those were the typical things for men. For women, typically histories of abuse. Being victims of violence or seeing their mothers as victims of violence would lead to, in some cases, identification as a lesbian. You're just not going to be in relationship with men, but sometimes to identifying as a man. And then maybe also still being in a lesbian relationship, but you're saying I'm a man and then I will not be victimized by men. Again, as I said this morning, these are common patterns. This does not replace the fact that every individual has their own story, which may or may not intersect with these patterns. It's worth knowing about the patterns, but it's not helpful to insist on imposing patterns on people if it might not fit their circumstance. This is almost never happened to young children. In our new context, we're seeing things with teens and young children that we've never seen before. Young girls, prepubescent girls identifying as boys was basically unheard of. Prepubescent boys identifying as girls happened. That was something clinically we were aware of. The vast majority of cases, it was resolved by puberty. And many of those boys grew up to be gay men. This is not controversial. This clinically, we know this. Now, and it may have been related to the fact, and again, not in every case, but generally, it may have been related to the fact that a young girl who acts atypical for her sex is not stigmatized. She's a tomboy. As a culture, that's just not problematic. A young boy who acts atypical for his sex, there's no cultural category for that that's not stigmatized. So parents are going to bring a little boy who likes playing with dolls into the gender clinic because this is, right? So there may be cultural layers behind the reason that we had clinically identified this as something that happened to young boys but not young girls. I can't say that that's the only factor, but it's not crazy to think that that was a factor. Now we have a completely different cultural context where prepubescent and pubescent and postpubescent boys and girls are identifying at rates we've never seen. Post-pubescent girls are now the most common clients at gender clinics, and they've gone from being virtually zero to increases in the thousands of percentiles, right? So something culturally is happening, and we talked about that in the first talk. Social media is a new context. Cultural approval for novel sexual or gender identities, right? You're nobody in high school, but if you identify in this way, now there's approval. We won't revisit all that. Just to note, we're in a new context. You might see some of the historical patterns in your pastoral care. You're more likely, just the numbers are just completely out of all proportion. The new context is going to send a lot more people your way. The person in front of you in a pastoral context, what are they experiencing? It probably took them incredible courage. They had to summon immense courage to meet with you as a representative of the church. So to respect from the start that this person who's presenting, and you can advance the slide one, Father, this person probably summoned immense courage to be there, right? So honor to that. The second thing is, one of the reasons they had to summon immense courage is because they've been primed, and we can move the slide. These slides are going to move quickly. They've been primed to expect rejection from the church, right? So you don't fulfill that prediction. That might be the last time you ever see that person. They've been primed to expect rejection, and if what they hear is acceptance, not acceptance of every bad idea, acceptance of the person, can be immensely healing. And lastly, is better understood as a victim of an ideology than a proponent of it, right? Which goes to Father Andrew's comments after the first session, right? Like, people are coming in wounded off the battlefield. They may have all kinds of bad ideas, but to consider them primarily as someone whose bad ideas need to be corrected is not starting on the right foot. That will come. They will let you know when they're ready to have their bad ideas challenged. They're probably coming to you because there's already something niggling in the back of their mind. But like, what's the line in scripture? Like, don't quench the fizzling wick or whatever it is. Like, gently, let it emerge, right? The person in front of you needs to hear some very specific things. They need to hear that they are loved. Without qualification. I was doing this work for the Archdiocese of Winnipeg years ago, and there was an older Polish priest in the front row who said, "I don't know anything about transgender, but I know that you are loved." I was like, "Good." Like, if that's where you are, if you literally don't know anything, you do know that. You know that you're loved. I know that God loves you, right? There's various forms this can take. God loves you. Depending on the personal relationship, it may or may not be appropriate to say, "I love you," but they are loved, right? Another thing they need to hear is they are not a mistake. Some of them will have got this idea that their experience of their sexed body being a cause of distress means that there's some kind of mistake, that God made a mistake, something like that. Cut that out as early as you possibly can. God doesn't make mistakes. You are not a mistake. They need, and the people affirming them, the people from the other side who are rushing to affirm them, may unintentionally be affirming that they are in fact a mistake, which is one of the reasons why that affirmation is not helping the way it's supposed to help. Because in the background, there's this, something's deeply wrong with you that needs fixing. If you need very serious surgery, very invasive surgery with serious long-term consequences, then what I'm saying to you is there's something wrong, right? And so affirming that they are not a mistake. We talked about this in response to a question from the last session. God has a plan for their life. This thing, whatever it is, whether it's a feeling inside or whether it's like they've come to you and they've had all the surgeries, or wherever they are along the path, it is very tempting to imagine that they got off the path, God's path for them at some point, and there's no way to get back. And that's just not how God works, right? God is with you at every point on the path. We can make bad decisions. Those have real consequences, but they are not so powerful that they can undermine God's plan and will for your life. Whenever you turn to God, God is there. You don't need to go find him somewhere else on some path that you left a long time ago. God has a plan for your life no matter what you have done, right? I find Paul, but all the saints, we all have different saints, but Paul was involved with murdering Christians, right? That's the story. He was a murderer. When Paul says, I am the worst of all sinners, we think, oh, that's hyperbole. Every great saint, has this heightened sense of sin, and they say, I'm a great sinner. Paul's like, I was approving the murder of Christians. That's what he's talking about, right? So if murdering Christians is not irredeemable, then nothing you've done is irredeemable, right? Okay. The person in front of you needs to talk. And so we need to be good listeners, right? One of the things we're going to do is we're going to use open-ended questions and encouraging statements, right? If you do hospital ministry or anything like that, you've maybe had some training. It's a similar kind of thing. Here's just a few things you can say. You can say things like, I can understand that. Notice, I'm not agreeing with your assessment of the world or anything else. I can understand that. I can understand how you feel that way, right? That sounds really hard. They might be completely off base with what they think about the world and the body and everything. That sounds really hard, right? Or just an invitation to say more. Oh, that sounds like a real thing there. Do you want to talk more about that, right? Open-ended questions and encouraging statements. You don't have to rush to affirm bad ideas, but you can say a lot of things that allow a person to continue opening up and sharing what they need to share. Next, silence is okay. Sometimes people need to sit in the quiet, and if we're uncomfortable with silence and we need to fill it with stuff, that can get in the way. So sometimes we need to let a person sit and just be present. And that in itself can be very healing. So don't be afraid of silence. I'm an extrovert, the extroverts among us. We want to fill the space. It gets awkward when it's quiet for too long. Sometimes you bite your tongue and wait, and I mean, it's a judgment call. At a certain point you say, is there anything more you want to say or whatever? But silence is not a problem. It can be part of the work. And lastly, this is something you will have learned with like healthcare stuff too. Just repeat things back to people. So what I'm hearing you say is that right? People feel heard when you can articulate what they're saying back to them, right? And check with them for understanding. Again, you can do all of this without affirming bad ideas, right? All of this. Okay, next. Answering questions. People are going to come with questions about church teaching, right? Let them lead. They're going to let you know when the time is right to explore church teaching. They might come in on the first day and say, I want to know what the church says about this. This young person I talked to thought maybe they could make sense of their experience by having been a soul that God put in the wrong body. They were trying. That was an honest attempt to make sense of their circumstance, right? But trying to give them clarity on church teaching when the real question is, am I accepted here? Am I loved here? It's putting the cart before the horse. Let them lead. They'll let you know. The first thing they want to know is this a person I can trust? Once they say this is a person I can trust, then I can ask the question that I'm scared about what the answer might be, right? So handle this with care. Relatedly, watch for the question behind the question. I have made this mistake. I like church teaching. I like talking about church teaching. I like clarity about church teaching. So if you ask me something and I know the answer, I will dive in and start telling you, right? And a lot of times, that's why I have the job I have. It's not a bad thing to be able to do that. My enthusiasm for giving a good, clear answer has meant that on occasion, I have not realized that they weren't asking the question. The surface question wasn't the real question. There was another question hiding under the surface question. And before I rushed to answer, I should have said, oh, that's interesting. Tell me where that's coming from. This is not an example related to this, but it's the one that's clearest in my own mind. I was doing a talk at an Anglican church. Me and the Anglican pastor were talking about the Eucharist, sort of Catholic Anglican symposium on the Eucharist. And an Anglican priest from Africa asked a question about kind of like, what makes wine wine? Like, when is it wine enough to work in the sacrament, right? And I knew there was medieval distinctions in Thomas Aquinas about like mustum. I don't know if any of us remember mustum from our seminary days, but like when the fermentation process is just starting, like in a pinch, whatever. Well, who cares? I mean, the guy asking me didn't care. So I gave this answer about mustum, and the audience's eyes glazed over, And then the pastor next to me, who had a lot more pastoral experience and not some hotshot theologian who knows theological things, said, tell me about the context. And it was a war zone. He's like, how do I do communion in a war zone when I can't get wine? That was the question. He doesn't care about mustum. You know what I mean? I missed the question behind the question. Why does he care about this? Because he's academically curious? No, he was dealing with a real pastoral situation, and I just missed it, right? Sometimes there's a question, if you're not sure where it's coming from, and especially if the answer might land like a punch, take a little time to understand where the question is coming from before you offer the answer, even if you love the answer. I love knowing church things, right? So watch for the question behind the question. Challenging assumptions, right? So people are going to be coming in with a lot of ideas and attitudes that they've picked up from the broader culture that are not helpful, that in fact have got them in some trouble and that have caused them a lot of pain, right? And so we want to be able to challenge their assumptions, but you handle this with care, because you do this wrong and you never see that person again, right? So how do you do it? One thing is, we can affirm people's feelings without affirming ideas, right? And people might think what they want is their ideas affirmed. They actually care about that less than having their feelings affirmed. Sometimes those two things get tangled together, and it's careful work to pull them apart. When we can't affirm ideas, there are still things we can affirm, and we can affirm people's feelings, like saying, that sounds like that was hard or whatever, right? So when you're challenging assumptions, that's more of a foundational premise, is we can affirm a feelings and leave room in the future to challenge ideas. Next, Socratic method is really helpful here. Just ask questions. Here's, I think I have examples. Well, it's, okay, not quite yet, but ask questions without an agenda, except to understand more fully what they think is true. And if there are things that are internally inconsistent in their worldview, and that's one of the things that happens with this, the internal inconsistency may in fact be what drove them into your office. For you to highlight the internal inconsistency on a diagram might feel like a threat. For them to be able to talk through the internal inconsistency and for you to give them permission to do that can feel like freedom that they don't get from the other community that's trying to affirm them, right? So just asking open-ended questions without agenda, but just to seek to understand and come to truth together can be very helpful. You've got time, right? Give it the time. Gentle challenges can look something like this. You can come up with your own phrases, but maybe these just get the gears turning, right? I wonder about that. Yeah, I've always wondered about that. I had this experience and I've wondered about that. Just allow, right? You just have a little different take, and you wonder how those things fit together. It seems possible to me that, right? Not you're wrong, but here, like one way of looking at that might be, or it seems possible to me, but then you're just throwing it back and you're letting them engage with that. It doesn't have to be yes or no, but this seemed possible. Is that possible? Could that work? Can that make sense of this, right? My understanding was that, right? There are other people in the world with other experiences, and I've talked to them, and they gave me this impression. I'm not telling you you're wrong and they're right. I'm just telling you that someone else shared this with me, and this was my understanding from them. How does that make sense in light of what you said? Is that a contradiction? Right? You could come up with a bunch of different ways. Let's go back one. Just leave that up. You could come up with 25 other phrases. Those are just, they show you, I think, the basic feeling of the phrase, right? Introduce a differentiation in a gentle way that allows them to wrestle with it. Checking our own expectations. We talked about this one in the Q&A earlier. It's okay if someone struggles their whole life. That's almost all the sinners that you deal with. Right? The people who come back with the same thing to confession over and over. People complain, I confess the same thing every month or whatever it is. Well, in some ways, that's better than having new problems every month. I mean, it's a little disheartening that we're not getting much better, but hey, if you're not getting worse, I'll take it, right? All of us are going to struggle with things our whole life. And it's not just people who are dealing with this kind of thing. As I said, if someone finds resolution, praise God. And it does happen. Especially nowadays where a lot of these things are surface level. In previous generations where this was not publicly approved, the people struggling with it were more likely to have a deep question. If it's like, it's a way I can get some positive attention in high school, it might be quite fleeting, right? So you may find people with resolution, praise God. But then you may find people who don't. There may be real, deep-rooted issues that are not going to be dealt with to their satisfaction or yours in this life. Well, welcome to the club. Like that's all of us, right? So for yourself to not think I'm wasting my time if they don't get where I want them to go, but also for them to know that God still has a plan for them, regardless of whether or not this gets resolved in the way that they would hope, right? So both your expectations and theirs. Second, time spent with people is never wasted. It is not a waste of time to meet with someone and show them God's love if it doesn't lead to the resolution that everyone hopes for, right? This will be redeemed. The time you put in with someone will be redeemed some way or other. Sometimes we're privileged to see that within this lifetime. Sometimes that's going to wait for the judgment before we can see it. But we can know in faith that you offer someone time and in love, and it's just not wasted. It's never wasted. Okay, I mentioned this already because it came up in Q&A, but I have a recommendation on names and pronouns because this is often like the very first decision you got to make. Someone comes to you with a new name or a new set of pronouns, and you have to decide what to do. And my principle is this is possible as an accommodation, but not as an affirmation, right? So if they're demanding that you say who I really am, say, well, I can't say something that I don't think is true, but out of respect for you, so that our relationship doesn't feel like a sledgehammer anytime I use your name, out of respect for you, I will do this until you tell me otherwise, which I find very helpful because it gives them an out that if the parents are celebrating and the Glitter family is celebrating, and they can feel really locked in and there's no out. And if you're the one person who says, I'm here and I respect you, until you tell me otherwise. Then when they have questions or they want to make a change, you've given them that opportunity. You give them an out. Now, I will say this is a prudential judgment that's based on your comfort level, your relationship with the person. The church does not say, in this case, do X, in this case, do Y. And right, this is a tricky thing. Pronouns are generally not used in face-to-face conversation. They're generally used when we have conversations about people who aren't there. So pronouns are quite easily avoided, in fact, in face-to-face conversation. And so sometimes you can just find ways of speaking that it's not even really an issue. But anyways, there we are. Lastly, I will just say, I've written at least, if you go down to the end, some resources. The resources thing is really tricky because there is so much out there. I could have recommended that you read a whole library. I'm going to recommend to you, if you read one book, and there's more than one good book, but if you read one book from a Catholic theological point of view, Abigail Favale's The Genesis of Gender, or anything that Abigail Favale does on the internet, I would recommend to you. Some of you may have heard of Abigail Shrier. She wrote, what's the name of her book on this? It's got a picture of a little girl with this irreversible damage. Has been very helpful to many parents who are struggling with decisions around this. It's not Catholic, but it's very helpful. She's going to accept things, about adults making certain decisions for themselves that as Catholics we would say are probably not the best decisions, although we would probably, it's a very different thing than rushing a child through certain kinds of things. So it's not Catholic, and be aware of that, but it's very helpful. But rather than giving you a million resources, I would just say I have a column on Our Sunday Visitor, and these are 4 columns that I have written on these questions. This is what happens when smartphones make gender unbearable. Do Catholics need to accept third genders? No one is intrinsically disordered. Maybe I'll say a word about that. This is usually language used about homosexuality, not about gender identity, but it gets thrown around either way. Young people will have heard the idea that the church says that they're disordered. The church does not say that anyone is disordered. So if someone comes to you in counseling and says, this is a question, right? Does the church say I'm disordered, or that being gay is disordered, or that being trans is disordered? The church, if you read the catechism, and I go into details in this piece, the catechism describes certain actions as disordered and inclinations towards actions as disordered. It never describes people as disordered. In fact, it's a category mistake. People are not even the kind of thing that could be disordered. And so you can say to any person, you don't need to explain it and sugarcoat it, and the church's teaching is very beautiful and the language is hard to understand and all this. No, the church just does not say you are disordered. Just doesn't say that. And if you want to give them the article, if you read it and think it would be helpful, but this is one of the questions that young people will have early on. They've heard that the church says they're disordered. You are the bearer of good news. The church does not say that. The last one is a question about intersex people, which I went into in some detail. So the QR codes are 1, 2, 3, 4, as related to the articles 1, 2, 3, 4. Anyways, you can get to them. And I think that's a good place to move on to questions.